Hello and welcome to Code to Cloud. And I'm your host as always, Kevin Evans. And today I am joined by Ned Bellavance or Balance. Have I said that right? I butchered that completely wrong, Ned.
That's no worries, man. Hi, I'm Ned Bellavance, and I am the co-host on this journey to Azure Landing Zones. We're gonna try to bring it in for a landing using Terraform, huh?
That is right. Yeah. So I came up with this crazy idea to um I was like, I'm gonna do one of our Azure landing zones, deploy it in Terraform. Now, obviously, we've got Bicep as well, right? For folks out there. And I was like, right, I'm going to do this. And I spoke to a few people and they're like, do you know how many resources it deploys? Like out the box. And I was like, yeah, like a couple of things could go wrong. Now, most of the time, I have a high success rate of deploying this, especially in customer environments, right? If I break it down. But yeah, I wanted to talk about what is an Azure landing zone, um, why we've got it, why it's there, where you can access it, that kind of thing, right? So yeah,
Well, let's
it's
let's start with just defining it because
yeah.
before you reached out to me, I'd heard the term Azure Landing Zone, but I hadn't really investigated it that much. So let's start with just like, what do you mean when you're talking about an Azure Landing Zone?
So cast your mind back, Ned, to 2017.
All
Woo,
right.
right? Maybe older, right? But like we're talking Azure ARM here, right? We're not talking classic Azure, right? And I was guilty of this myself. You had an Azure environment, and it was pretty free flowing, right? Like
hmm
you built it to your will, right? Which is kind of crazy because for decades we've been told how to build networks, identity providers on prem. Like, you spun up Windows AD and it came out with a structure right out the bat, right? Like users and groups, right? Like it'd have a basic, GPO template policy, it'd have a tree and all that kind of good stuff, right? And we were pretty much mandated, like, this is how you should build it, right?
Mm.
Like, don't get me wrong, there was loads of weird and wonderful configurations, but
Yeah.
it was sort of like a free for all in the cloud, especially in Azure. So we were adopting all these new technologies, but unsuspectingly, we were backing ourselves into a organic corner or building ourselves organically into a corner, right? And
hmm
I'm talking, connectivity, right, is the biggest one. Like, VNets are a bit more agile now, but back then, once it was deployed, that was your address range, right?
Yeah.
And that's what you were getting, right? It was those kind of things. And, how do we put governance around our Azure environments as well? Now, we did have something called Blueprints. I don't know if you remember those back in the day. They were like the first sort of launch of this, but Azure Landing Zones really comes into the whole cloud adoption framework piece that we've got going on. So you may have heard of WAF, well architected framework, right? Like all
Yeah.
the CSPs do it, right? All have their own flavors. But this was a more prescriptive approach on what good looks like to build an Azure environment. So it doesn't matter if you were like born in the cloud to a 30, 40-year old enterprise heavy organization, right? There's a level for you, right, to deploy. So if you go to aka.ms/ALZ, right, that'll take you to some Microsoft Docs page on what a landing zone is and how to get going, right? The great news is, and I'm just trying to speed it up here a little bit because we've got a lot to go through today.
Sure.
The great news is, like I said before, the customer architecture and engineering teams, right, have developed some code for organizations to consume for free, right? It's publicly on GitHub. It's maintained by Microsoft, right? And it has somebody as an owner, right? So it can be sort of community driven, but it's still like owned by a Microsoft FTE full time employee, right? Similar to the Azure verified modules, right? That you may have heard of, right?
Yeah.
Terraform and Bicep again. So we're going to look at the Terraform variant today. So a lot of people will probably be used to going to the Terraform registry, copy and pasting manifest files off there, right? I mean, I cheat these days with GitHub Copilot. I've become so lazy, right? But we don't really do that with the ALZ, right? Like we can go to the registry, but I'm going to walk you through that process because you feel like you're responsible for your own modules and everything else. Imagine it like when you're deploying this ALZ, it's like church and state are separate, right? So,
Okay.
and what I mean by that is that you shouldn't be tying up your applications with the modules that you're using for your ALZ deployment, right? So they're two different life cycles, right?
Right.
And I'm keen to
This
put
is
there. Go for it, Ned.
kind of like
Sorry.
the underlay. It's the literal infrastructure on which everything else is built in your Azure environment. And so
Completely.
this is probably not going to change a lot. This is going to be very stable in comparison to application environments that are probably evolving more quickly.
So let me try and get this. Try and zoom.
That is quite an eye chart. I saw that earlier and I was like, whoo, that's a lot of things.
I can recite this in my sleep now. So
I'm sorry?
yeah, but this is what good looks like, right? So look, we still want you to be creative, right? It's your environment, but at the end of the day, there's a better way of doing things, right? And this will help you scale long term. Now, if we talk about applications life cycles, like they may be a couple of years old before they get replaced with a newer architecture, so to say, right? Through a modernization piece. The same goes for a landing zone, Ned. It's just at a different pace, right? And I want to emphasize that because people think, great, I've deployed this, I'm gold for 10 years, right? Because they feel like it's on prem, right? You build your network and effectively on prem, you just replace your appliances, right? Things don't
Right.
dramatically change, right? Like you upgrade appliances, be that network equipment, right, or storage arrays or servers or whatever, right? And you normally do those at different milestones as well. So in here, it's stuff to get you up and running in the best possible way, and there's different levels to this. But the biggest one is the prerequisites are that you need to have an Entra ID tenant, right? Because if you haven't got one of
Hmm.
those, then you can't add subscriptions.
Right.
Depending on the size of organization you are, we suggest that you have multiple subscriptions to divide your core resources up. And you'll see that in the middle of the screen here. We sort of divide up identity management connectivity for good reason, right? That means that you can apply different roles and responsibilities within an organization as well, right? It also
Right.
reduces the blast radius if you want to make changes, right?
Yeah. If
We've
you have
all
a
been
team
there.
that's in charge of connectivity, you can give them access to the connectivity subscription and they're not going to break your identity stuff.
Exactly, right? Or we might have, we speak about Azure policy as the governance engine for Azure, right?
Hmm.
Completely, it's understated that platform, right? Like that Azure policy governance engine it really reduces the hard work of you thinking what policies you need because you can go out there and grab industry policies, right, that are baked in, like PCI compliance, right, or FedRAMP or whatever it is, right? Whatever your poison's going to be, like you can just apply it to your Azure environment. But it also means that you can apply it these management groups here at the top, which are basically metadata containers which host subscriptions. So to your point again, the connectivity engineer only has access to connectivity, or the identity engineer only has access to identity. But again, from a change point of view, you apply the changes at these management group layers, right? And these can host multiple subscriptions. So we use something
Okay.
called subscription democratization. So that I know, right? It's a nice term. What it means is the boundary is at the subscription layer rather than the resource group layer, because
Okay.
back to 2018, resource groups probably weren't as disciplined as they are now, right? Let's be honest.
True. But at the time, I knew a lot of organizations that would have one or two subscriptions at the most, and they
Correct.
were doing most of their RBAC through resource groups. So
That's
they'd
right.
spin up
Yeah.
an empty resource group for some application team and then give that application team full permissions over just that resource group.
I've worked with customers that are up in the thousands of subscriptions.
That's a lot of subscriptions.
It's a
That's
lot,
a lot
right?
to manage.
And that's where the whole pros and cons of this comes as well, because what happens if you're just like a two person team, right? With 50
Right.
employees, do I need 10 subscriptions, right? It's it's economy of scale, right? Kind of thing. I always think that you probably need the identity management and connectivity subs as your core pillars. But
Hmm.
then when it actually comes to your landing zones, right, which are your spokes, right? Because we refer things back to network connectivity, right? We have a hub and the spoke topology, right? But we also have Azure V1 now, right? Which we'll talk about shortly. What we're trying to do is create something that's scalable for you to plumb in a spoke for a workload to land and be consumed as fast as possible in the most secure and governed way.
Okay.
Okay, that makes sense.
So what we're actually trying to build out is those three that you just talked about, those subscriptions, and then those enable you to add additional subscriptions that will be part of the landing zone group. And those subscriptions are where actual applications would be deployed to run.
Correct. Right. So
Okay.
the subscription democratization, here's a great example I use, because like they go, why should I have separate subs? Well, say like if you had a VDI solution, a virtual desktop solution,
Mm-hmm.
well, there's going to be some high compute costs attached to that, right? Regardless,
Yeah.
right? Put it in its own subscription. When it comes to billing then and running the billing reports, right? You're just, that whole service is costed, right? In one sub.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes it easier on the FinOps people as well, right? And the
Gotcha.
billing department and everything else. And then when you run like, I don't know, audits, security audits, you making it easier because you're breaking it up, right? You're
Mm-hmm.
breaking it up into chunks rather than just having the whole company resources in one subscription, right? But
Right.
yeah, logical containers is probably a better way, right? Like a resource group was a logical container. It's a metadata container, right? With the resource location and the RBAC policies. And then when you start deploying resources in there, that's when it starts to cost money, right? So those management groups at the top are sort of like, the best way to refer to them is, do you remember your Active Directory trees, right? Back in the day.
Couldn't forget them if I wanted to.
I mean, they're burnt into the back of my head as well, right? That's what the management groups are like. Users and computers, right? AD objects, that kind of thing. And
Mm-hmm.
Azure policies I'm not going to say similar, but if we think of GPOs, group policy objects, and applying policies on our domains on prem, very similar as like we target the OU, right? The organizational unit to apply that,
Right.
right? Just to clarify that a little bit more. You can't see it, but it's grayed up at the top. But like that's where Azure AD or Entra AD really plays part, because that's, if you think of Azure like a pyramid, and I know the logo for Entra is a pyramid,
It is. Yeah.
but the identity's at the top of the pyramid and it scales down.
Right. So everything sits underneath the identity capstone.
Exactly. Right. So yeah, a nice little diagram there. I'm just going to see if I can try and get out this diagram. I think it's come up as a new tab. But anyway, so we've got a couple of options here. So module capability, right? The documentation on this is really good. Like a typical engineer, I'm not a fan of documentation, but this is a really good place to start, right? It's very methodical in its approach. It's broken down into the sections that we talked about, like core resources, just to get you up and going, like management groups and subscription organization. So back to that, if I'm a born and if I don't know what I'm doing and I just want to get a baseline, just
Hmm.
deploy the core resources, right? Just you can add these as you go through. So management resources, connectivity resources. The identity subscription is a weird one, right? Because that's purely for domain controllers in
Hmm.
Azure. Because obviously Entra ID is a IDP, right? Identity platform, right? So it's for VMs, right? Or for people that need that traditional authentication, right? If we're deploying cloud apps or AKS or whatever it is, right, we're probably going to go with the cloud native approach, right? From an IDP, right? So we out the box actually apply some policies around the identity subscription to put you in the best standing, right? And what I mean by that is like you can't deploy a public IP in there because
Okay.
guess what? We don't want domain controllers exposed to the internet. Now,
Probably not. Yeah.
no, no, it's not a good look, right? Not for anybody, right? So and people use domain controllers as tools or bastion hosts as well. I don't know if you've ever seen yes, Ned, that smile on your face, right? It's
I have some horror stories involving small business server that we can save for another time.
that's exactly where because people go, well, I can just make all my changes on this box, right? So we're trying to break those habits,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like, it's a topic for another day, but there's a service called Azure Bastion, which is built for that, right? If
Yep.
you need to, if you need to like build that tool bench, right, in the cloud and have a tool server for people to jump on, right, and manage the VMs, then use that, right? Protect yourself properly. Right?
Right.
We want to hide those domain controllers as much as possible. We don't, reducing the attack surface, right?
Right.
But if I pick on one like connectivity resources here, so the design areas here, right? Again, so network topology and connectivity. If we have a look at this, back to that diagram there, this is why it's deploying, right? And we've got two flavors here, and the reason I picked on this one is because this is the one we're going to deploy today. I was going to put some meat on the bones, right? And on the right
Hmm.
hand side here, we've got a bit of a tree going on. So Microsoft speak, just to translate, we do things in levels. So level 100 is basic, beginner, high level, get you started.
Right.
The higher the number, guess what? The more complex it is, right? So it goes up to level 400. That's for like the hardcore people out there, right? That want to change things up. We're going to be doing level 300 today. We're going to be doing a virtual WAN deployment, right? So
Hmm.
we'll talk about that. But if you come in here, um, hub and spoke is the traditional method, right? That's where everybody, because they try and replicate what they did on premise from a connectivity point of view, right? Um, and they try to do it in the cloud, right? And, hub VNet with a firewall and all routes point to the firewall, right? Or we've got a site-to-site VPN back to on-premise, right? Whatever it is. Azure V1's a bit more of a managed offering. I I was speaking to someone the other day, and I don't know if you've seen this, Ned, but networking, and I don't mean networking is turning up at marketing events and business type events, but networking skill sets are a dying breed, right? Especially in the cloud. I'm shocked. Like I don't know about you, Ned, but back in the day, for me, if you got that CCNA, you were the person, right, in the office, right, in the technical team, right? Like
Uh,
you knew your
you're
stuff,
not
right?
kidding. I went through that exact experience. I got my CCNA probably in 2004, 2005, and I became the network guy for our IT team because I knew just a little bit more than everybody else. I could do, site or subnet calculations in my head. Look at me. I can figure out a subnet mask. Um, I have seen that same loss of networking skills when it's applied to cloud. And I'm not sure how we recover from that, except just put together better tooling that prevents people from shooting themselves in the foot.
that's where Azure VWAN helps with that. You effectively feed it IP address ranges, and it takes care of things, right?
Well, there
So
you go.
there's
That's my
peering,
kind of solution.
creates mesh
Don't
networks, that kind of thing, right?
don't make me know BGP. I
That's
don't
where
want.
I'm going, right, with it, because
Yeah.
like I couldn't pass that CCNA. Like I got like dyslexia. I couldn't do the side annotations right in my head, like because you had to do it
Hmm.
for the exam. Remember, they used to give you examples, and it just couldn't compute, right? But I wouldn't say it's as deep as it used to be, but you still need to know networking in the cloud, right? You still need to figure out, IP address management is critical, right? Like, how
Right.
many addresses have I got available? Am I being efficient with my address space? And it always ties back to security as well. Like a lot of customers now and folks, they basically built a data center inside of Azure. They don't want any public endpoints. They want everything to be private, right?
Right.
Even though they break out in HTTPS. That's a battle for another day, right? But what I'm trying to get at is it's it's like, well, you need to know it's software defined networking, right? And it can all be controlled via Terraform. Like I was writing Azure firewall policies a few years back via Terraform, right? So the security guys love that because it's forensic. You write your
Right.
policy, you push it, peer review, goes through the smoke screen test, right? In Azure DevOps or GitHub, gets approved, pushes to the environment, and they can see on the code line by line what's changed,
Hmm.
right? That's where I think like it's really, really come on. But if we have a look in here, right, like this tells you the resources that it's going to deploy as well, so you can sort of validate it at the end. But resource groups, virtual networks, subnets, virtual network gateway. Spoiler alert, that takes time to deploy.
Yes, it
Azure
does.
firewall, right? Like you can bring your own firewalls, right? That becomes a bit complex. So the Palo Altos, the Ciscos, the Fortinets, right? Like whatever your ice cream flavor, different configurations, obviously, right? But it can be done. You know, I'm not biased towards Azure Firewall, but when I really sink into those cloud native roots that I've got now, it's scalable. It's not a virtual machine. I can programmatically interface with it via an API, right? Like it's once it's deployed, it's like, well, throw the traffic at me and I'll scale, right? At the end of
Right.
the day. And then when the traffic died down, it scales back in, right? That kind of thing. And it's cloud native.
Hmm.
Right? And I can manage it inside of Azure as well, right? Like, I think it's under the security center. I mean, if they still call it that, they may have changed the name of that by now, right? But in there, you can go into firewalls, right, and break that down and everything else, right? So I kind of like that, right? Public IP addresses because we need a PIP, right, on our Azure firewalls because we're going to be breaking traffic out of that kind of thing. And then there's virtual network peering, right? So I know the team's been working hard that you can now like I think they've written some code for spokes. That we're not going to do that today, but like a spoke is virtual network with a network security group with some subnets on it, maybe some private endpoints, right? And that's where our application's going to land at the end, right? Like web app or data space, whatever you want, right? So how you need to pair that back to the hub, right? So that's why
Right.
pairings are in here as well.
Okay. Makes sense.
Um, so here's my warning. Guess what's switched on by default? The DDoS
Uh,
protection plan.
yeah.
Right. So you need to check that because there's a cost associated with it. That's all I'm
I
going to
see.
say. There's a true or false flag. Very effective tool, very effective platform, right? Like, don't get me wrong, Azure's protected from DDoS out of the box anyway, right? Like, you may have seen it in the news when, you know, we've held back the torrents, right? No one's noticed, and we're like sweating in
Yeah.
the background, right? Kind of thing, right? But like, you know, a lot of my retail customers will have this, if that makes sense, because of, you know, Black Friday is coming up, right?
Yeah.
Need to be, they don't want to be taken down at the wrong time of the year, that kind of thing, right? So they'll have that enhanced DDoS protection plan. So the module can be optionally deployed and links virtual networks at the plan needed. So it says here, due to the platform limitations, DDoS protection plans can only be enabled for traditional virtual networks. Vertical hub support is not currently available. So your hub and spoke, it's on there. And the $1 million question is, why should I choose between hub and spoke and Azure VWAN?
Mm-hmm.
Well, hub and spoke gives you more control. So if you want to your point, Ned, if you like a bit of BGP, a bit of route tabling, right? All that good stuff, then go down that route, right? Like Azure VWAN has only been out for a couple of years and is a really good maturity level now. Like I'm seeing a lot of like FSI, so financial service institutes, go to VWAN, right? Like it's mature enough. But again, it's a bit more managed by Microsoft, so it's like this is how it's going to work rather than, you know, that networking person that loves to bend the connectivity to their will, right? There's pros and cons with both, right? Go and
Sure.
check it out. I think it's like if you go to the Microsoft Docs page, there'll be a connectivity section, right? Like
Okay.
pros and cons. Um, DNS, because it's always DNS's fault, right?
Always.
Always. So this module deploys private DNS zones for private endpoints. So we'll look through that as well. I'm not going to go over this too much, but Azure services need to be populated. So like storage accounts, right? That kind of thing, right? With a DNS zone, if you're going to be using more of the cloud native and not having a domain controller to host your DNS service, right? I know other folks may host their DNS from a third party point of view. I've seen some weird and wonderful solutions over the years, right? All in the all in the uh all in the battle of trying to save money, but I think it costs more money operationally in the long term. But yeah,
Probably.
so there's
Yeah.
there. So I'm just gonna go back because I feel like I've gone into the deep end straight away because that's how I roll. Um, let's just look at core resources very quickly because I think this is a great example for people to understand. So the first thing we're going to deploy is the management group structure with platform, landing zones, I think decommissioned and sandbox out of the box. Like they're predefined, right? You don't have to sit there with a resource naming committee and spend 3 days trying to figure out your naming convention for this. Like use ours, right? Like it's prescriptive.
Right.
And we're going to be deploying the identity management groups. These are resources, by the way. And then we're going to move those subscriptions into those management groups. And this is a really good one to get started with. So again, as you can see, the resource types that are part of this is management groups, subscriptions, policy assignments, policy definitions to get you up and running, right? So we assign some policies out of the box. So like even tells you the resource count there is 180 resources with the default configuration, right? Most of them are policies, by the way,
Okay. I was going to
right?
say that doesn't seem like you would have 180 if you're just setting up some management groups and associating subscriptions. But if it's all those policies
It's the policies.
individually, then those add up quickly. Yeah.
So there's some stuff out of the box, right, to get you up and running. You know, um, don't do stupid things with privileged accounts, that kind of thing, right? Or you know, better practices around securing your environment from a governance point of view, right?
Mm-hmm.
I did have pushback from one customer. They said, well, I don't think we're ready for those policies yet. And I'm like, well, the way we look at it is if you fail, we fail. Right? From a security point of view. So,
Right.
and we used to let customers do what they want to a certain point, right? And it didn't work out well, right? Like the feedback we got from the community was tell us what good looks like, right? So once you're on board, you're okay. It becomes business as usual, right? There's always some pain there, right, to begin with, but once you get on board, it's part and parcel, right? Okay, so we're going to be deploying a level 300, and there's a load of documentation here, right? But I want it to just come down because I really like the way they structure this out. And Ned, I look for your judgment on this as well, right? With
Sure.
your experience. But what I like about this is how it's broken down into chunks. So if you're starting off in your Terraform journey, this is a great place to start, believe it or not, right? Even though this 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 module might seem complicated, right? Because it's good to get inspiration, right? If you don't know where to start, what things should look like, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a terraform.tf resource block, right? Standard stuff, Azure RM providers, the version control, that kind of stuff, right? In its own separate file. Now, I know some people like mix it up with the main file, right? Like I've seen that, right? I probably used to do it, but I kind of
Yeah.
like this because then from a change management point of view, I know that I'm not messing with it, right? Like it's there in the background on the left.
Yeah. What I've seen consistently adopted most places is having that separate Terraform.tf that's for your Terraform block. And sometimes the providers, or they'll have a separate providers.tf that's just the provider instantiation.
So they break it down further, right? Okay.
Yeah, I think it depends on how many providers you're going to have in a given config. So if you're going to have like 10, 15 providers being used, having a separate file that you can go to for the maintenance of those is kind of nice.
Okay. I like that because it just simplifies things, right? Like I've seen some weird and wonderful stuff with Terraform. I've seen people use Terraform for stuff that it shouldn't be used for and over engineered it, right?
Yeah.
So breaking it up into blocks as much as possible makes it easier for the next human being to read it, as I like to say, right?
Yeah. I always tell people Terraform doesn't care because Terraform takes all the .tf files and mashes them together into a single config. So it could care less how you've broken things up, but humans care. Humans care an awful lot. So do what's nice for humans.
I completely agree, right? It could be 6 months before you look at the code again as well.
You are also a human being, so be nice to yourself,
Be
your
nice to
future
yourself.
self.
That's a Code to Cloud endorsed be good to yourself message, right? Don't
Yeah.
overcomplicate Terraform. Again, variables.tf. Here's some examples in here, right, of basic variables. Now you can use a TF environments file, right? Like if you wanted to, right? I've got colleagues that do that. For this example, right? I've just got local string variables to keep it simple, right? Kind of thing. And then I've got some variables in my HashiCorp cloud, right? My Terraform cloud backend as well, right? For my subscriptions and stuff. But yeah, main.tf, right? This is where, and we'll look at my main.tf, but again, this is a great place to start to come in and get inspiration on writing your manifest file, right? So you don't go off and clone the repo, right? To get started, you build out your manifest file, your provider file, your Terraform file, sorry, your variables, right? And then some other bits and pieces that we'll touch on later. And
Okay.
then when we run the Terraform init command, we pull that down from the registry, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's tied into the Terraform public registry. So for the folks out there using Tofu, and we're not going to get into the whys and why nots, you may
Let's
run
not.
into problems here, right? Because I don't believe you can reference the Terraform.
You can. So
You can,
there
right?
is now an OpenTofu public registry that you can use to pull registry content.
Okay. So I don't know if this is on there because I know obviously
As far
we
as I know, it's a mirror of what's on the public
okay,
registry.
okay, okay.
Um, but all the endpoints point directly at the GitHub repositories. They don't point back at the Terraform public registry because that would be a violation of the license.
That's right. This is the supported way. That's probably a better way of me
That
explaining it,
works for me.
right? I got a love for Tofu as well, right? We've had them on the show before, obviously with the CNCF and everything else. But for this instance, right, we're just going to go through what we've got available here, right, from a
Mhm.
supportability point of view. Then we have like settings.connectivity.tf, which is like a local answer file. I might be showing
Okay.
my age here because I used to build gold images, right, back in the day, right, for
Yeah.
Windows, right. But effectively, it's similar to a JSON file, but it's Terraform answer file, right? Like, and in here we would specify our what kind of topology are we deploying, right? The address prefix for our primary hub VNet, you know, the location that we're going to be deploying it in, the SKUs, right? Because there's different SKUs like standard and premium, right? If we're talking about Azure Firewall, the scale units, that kind of thing, right? Your favorite thing here, Ned, BGP settings, right? If we want to inject that kind of evil into our lives, right? That kind of thing. So it's all in here, right? And then we have the secondary region, right? And down here is the most, and this is why I always check back on the website because this list keeps growing. But in here we have our private link services and our DNS. Obviously, the Azure resource list is ever eternal, right? It just keeps growing.
Right.
So it's good to come back and check here and add these to the bottom of your manifest to your local configuration file, right? Just to add those from a supportability point of view inside your landing zone.
Sure.
And again, private link locations, Northwest Europe, right? Those are just examples. Obviously, you can change those to supported regions in Azure, right? Wherever you are in the world, whatever works for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you get some nice screenshots in here as well. What's going to be deployed, management groups, the policy assignments, what you get in terms of a deployed connectivity resources, that kind of thing, right? So you can come back and reference this and go, did it work out okay? Did we get there, right? I don't think I'm able
Right.
to zoom on that picture, but in there's Azure Firewall, right? There's an express route gateway, right? Like, depending on your connectivity requirements, it's in there. And the famous DDoS, right? Which I said, be careful,
Right.
right? If you
That'll
deploy
cost you
this
some money.
and you didn't know, and then tell the boss I've done a great job of deploying the landing zone, and then 30 days roll by and that bill comes through the mail and they're like, what happened? Go and check to see if this DDoS is in there, right?
Right.
And then there's all the private link stuff, right? So, but anyway, I feel like we've touched on this a lot. Like, if you ever have an issue on here as well, don't be shy to raise an issue on here via the GitHub. Like, the team is very respondent. I believe there's also an Azure Landing Zone community call. I'm trying to, but you can contribute to the code. Like, if we go to contributing down here, because they love feedback, right? The team's really good. Like, they're the way they shape this product is from the community and from customers,
Mm-hmm.
from real life scenarios, right? They want to hear about it, right? So again, raising an issue, feature requests, you've got a really good idea that's worked for you and it could work for everybody else. Go in here, raise that, contributing to the code, contributing to the documentation, right? To get yourself up and going. So let's bring up VS Code. Let's Let's get the juices going. Right. So all I've done is built out a repo locally. It's my own. Got the main.tf. It's got my settings.connectivity that we saw as an example, right?
Sure.
So I'm going to be deploying in East US today, right? That's closer for me, just about. I could deploy it in Canada Central, right? It's probably even closer. I just feel warm and fuzzy inside when I deploy to East US, right? But like my address range for my VNet hub, right, is in there. I'm not deploying any VPN gateways today, but I could if I wanted to. I'm going to be deploying Azure Firewall. I'm going to be deploying the standard SKU here.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I'd already deployed a Azure policy, I think it's called Firewall Manager anyway, you can deploy a base policy. It's written in JSON via Terraform, and you can reference it here. So when you spin up that firewall, say if this was like an additional region or whatever, right, then you can go off and get that base template to start locking down that firewall immediately, right?
Okay.
Or introduce your open ports or whatever, right? Your configuration. So there's that, and private IP address ranges, the kind of threat intelligence, all the different configurations that can be applied to an Azure firewall is in here, right? So go and check out the Azure Firewall module on the Terraform registry, because you can get a breakdown in there of what feature does what, right? If you're not too sure on what it is, right? It'll break it down. And then obviously availability zones. So I want it deployed depending on region, but if it's got 3 data centers in the region, I want this scaled across all 3 zones, right, for resiliency. And then we've got the secondary location, right, which is West US. Top tip, it's going to have a different IP address range than the primary region.
Seems like a good idea.
I've seen that happen a lot. Why wouldn't they peer? Well, guess what?
So do you find that most people, when using this module, have all their settings hard coded in a .tf file as opposed to passing values through input variables?
I think out of the box, it's just to get you up and running. I think you could take it to a next level, right, and have them inputted. I did see someone do it through the CLI once, Ned.
That seems
They were
extreme.
there a while, right? Like I was like, no.
Right.
So you could pass this up into a variables module somewhere else, right, from an input. So you could do that. I got a colleague, and he likes to use the environment variables thing, right? Like use this answer file to get that up there as well. But yeah, I think this way was done because it was just easier to get people up and running out of the box. Like again, it's just inspiration, right?
Yeah. I kind of look at it like, since this is not an environment that has to change dynamically a lot, you want changes to be captured in the code, whether those are actual resource changes or just configuration setting changes. And so by including all of that in the code you're checking in, like a config file,
Yep.
Those changes are captured and auditable over time. The only time I wouldn't want to check it in is if it was some sort of sensitive value that I was concerned about putting into source control.
So that is here. Like you could, yeah. So out of the box, like the variables, right? Like for the subscription IDs or the tenant ID, you shouldn't put them in there, but like they're referenced there. So what do you do, right? Well, in this instance, we're using Terraform Cloud, right? So we're referencing our variables somewhere else. They're a bit more sensitive, right? So they're further up the stack. They're outside the code. But again, it's the same for GitHub Actions, right, and everything else, or Azure DevOps, right? Having those variables up there, you can reference them there, right, as a variable group, right? So you can pull those down. But I think it's a great catch. It is more static this because 9 times out of 10, once the hub's deployed, nobody wants to mess with it ever again, right? Like,
Right. Especially, it connects everything. So if you break the hub, you break everything.
major change controls.
Right.
It's normally the guy with the CCNA, right, gets rolled out.
That's me.
But yeah.
So this local value that you're defining here, that's consumed directly by the module, right?
Correct.
If we go into the main.tf, you're just passing it this entire local value.
Yeah. So there's management there.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I've commented these two out is because I said we're going to do identity and connectivity, right? I do them in this order. It doesn't mean it's the right order. It's the one that's worked best for me from my experience, right?
I see.
So, and we've just cheekily like just commented them out. So when we do the Terraform in it and the plan and apply and all that good stuff, it just cuts it out for the time being, right? It's just ease for the video. But yeah, we're pulling that local inputs file here. So for like management here, we've got stuff like the log analytics, right? Piece. So we talked about connectivity a lot, but in here we've got how do you centralize logging, right? That's one of our better practices by using an Azure Landing Zone. Again, Ned, cast your mind back, right? It's 2018, 2019. You deployed an app, a web app, and you got a free log analytics workspace with it, right? It was like chucked in along with App Insights. And
right.
they were in the people had multiple log analytics workspaces when actually they only needed one because it's a conduit for all your logs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perf, security, everything else. And now we have stuff like Sentinel that sits on top of that to scan it all for all the security magic, right? So we have stuff in here like retention of logs, right? So there's a variable for that. I think it's 30 days out of the box. We'll go through the variables. Enable monitoring for VMs, true. Agent health assessment, anti-malware, that kind of thing. Service mapping, SQL assessments, solution for updates, right? That kind of thing. These things are then enabled out of the box from a management point of view, right? You can add more depending on what you want to be in there, right? You just add it to this file.
Okay. And is this applying policies at the management group level to trickle down to all your subscriptions?
Yeah.
Okay. I gotcha.
So when you deploy the resources in there, the policy gets applied to them straight away and they're in governance, right? They're ready to go.
Okay.
Same for identity. Identity is a lot smaller.
Right. We're not deploying any domain controllers today.
We're not going to be doing that.
Oh.
I feel like we should do it for nostalgia purposes at some point, Ned. Maybe we'll come back, right?
It would be like a throwback for me, for sure.
Maybe we should look at what a new modern day domain controller looks like. I don't know. Maybe there's an episode in that, right? Like I know
it's easy. It doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. And then
resource not found.
They headless, right? Like server core, right? All that good stuff. But yeah, we're gonna apply different policies like deny public IPs because we don't want domain controllers out on the internet because that would be stupid. I'm just gonna say how it is because it is stupid, right? Like why would you want that on the internet, right? You can't RDP from the internet again. Why would you want to do that? And you can't deploy a subnet without a network security group. So network security group is like a local IP table, allow, deny, ranges, that kind of thing, right? It's a very basic form of, it's an network access control list for the folks that remember those, right? It's
sure do.
Basic, but effective.
Yep.
It's like turning the taps on. They're either on or they're off. Right? Zero trust. Right? We're starting to build those layers in, right? And then, you don't really want to be deploying Azure backup on the domain controllers, right? Because there's a whole different framework for high availability for domain controllers. Normally we deploy them in pairs as well, and that's
Hmm.
also part of the replication, right? And then there's other tools to obviously back up and restore virtual machines, not virtual machines, but domain controllers. So if we look at variables, there's a nice list in here. We'll only go through a couple, but subscription identity, subscription ID for connectivity is a string. Obviously, I'm using HashiCorp Cloud, right? So it's going to reference that. It's just going to push it up the stack until it gets there. It's going to do the call. Client ID, client secret, tenant ID. Then there's stuff in here that becomes more cosmetic to your organization. So the root management group variable. So this variable is used to specify the ID for the root deployment. So instead of it saying Contoso, right, or whatever, right, like your fictitious company name, we're using Code to Cloud today. And then the root name is Code to Cloud Labs, right? Those are my examples. But let's say your organization has a name or has an abbreviation, you would put that in here, right? Does that make sense?
Hmm.
Again, location, default locations East US. It's going to be deploying the connectivity resources is set to true. So you could set them to false in here. I've commented them out on the main file, but you could control everything in here, obviously. Again, for identity as well, I got GitHub Copilot to comment all these up for me. So I cheated a little bit. That's the beauty of GitHub Copilot. You can just say, write me a load of comments for my variables, right? It'll go off and do it. But again, when we're talking about log analytics, the retention in days, I've left it at 50. You can lower this. It's more of a business decision because there's a cost associated to it. But some organizations want to keep them for a very long time because it's forensics, right? They're
Right.
regulatory compliant, right? They have to have them, right? And then there's a security email address in here that you have to put in. So we're just going to leave the default in here. But again, you'll have a distribution list somewhere where the ops people will need to get this email. Put it in here.
Right.
And so on and so on. So any questions on that, Ned, before I move on to the manifest file and we get
No, I think
started?
it all puts together pretty nicely. You got most of your settings being defined locally in those settings dot whatever group dot tf as local values, and then stuff that needs to be more dynamic, the subscription IDs and the credentials you're using to actually do all this deployment, that's set up as input variables.
Correct.
And we're not deploying this using the local CLI, right? We're going to be deploying this through Terraform Cloud, HCP Terraform, or are you actually going to be using the local CLI to
I
deploy,
am.
but having it run up in HCP Terraform?
That's exactly what we're going to be doing. I was going to pipeline it, right? But then I was like, well, when folks get this, it's all local out of the box, right? So it's local state, right? It's Terraform CLI. You do an AZ login, blah, 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 right? So I was like, right, how do we get the best of both worlds just to show people how to go through? Now, better practices around managing Terraform state in Azure is one, either use HashiCorp Cloud, right, which makes it easier. Two, use a storage account. And then you use stuff like containers, right? Inside the storage account. Not to get mixed up with Kubernetes containers and all that good stuff. Containers, right?
Yeah.
So you really need to think about your strategy here because your state file is your imagine if you're in the finance department and they have the ledger, right? Everything that comes in out the business, everything that goes out the business, right? Everything is counted for, right? Bank accounts, payments, invoices, whatever. Terraform state's the same. So you want that Azure storage account to be replicated, backed up, right? Because you'll need that state file if you're going to have to rebuild this environment or reference it in the future, right?
Yeah.
sometimes it's better to have the storage account option because you may need to change the state file or make it disappear for troubleshooting reasons that are unknown, right? Maybe it's better to have that there. I don't know, right? It's all pros and cons. There may be better ways. Ned's like, don't do that. Don't do what Kevin said, right? But
Yeah, I
I've
mean,
had it where you've destroyed everything and there's still remnants and you go to redeploy it, right? Because you've done a typo or whatever, right? And you've got to go in there and destroy the state file, right?
there's some ways to accomplish that, whether it's in an Azure storage account or sitting up on HCP Terraform. The reason for this specific use case, I would prefer to use something hosted like HCP Terraform, is you're using this to build out your Terraform, your Azure infrastructure.
Yep.
Where does that storage count reside in this framework that you're using to stand up the what's managing your Azure infrastructure? So I'm like, I don't want the thing that I'm managing to also hold the config of itself.
Church and state. Keep them separate.
Maybe so in this case, whether it's HCP Terraform or hell, spin up an S3 bucket. I don't care, but like, don't store this really important configuration with the actual like management of it. I would want to keep those two a little separate.
I completely agree. But don't deploy in an S3 bucket because you're deploying in Azure.
Yes, I didn't say that. You didn't hear me.
I've never seen that done. That would be one for the books, literally.
Oh, I've seen it.
Right, okay. So, yeah. So what we're going to do is I'm going to get the show on the road. We're going to start deploying. So I just
All
wanna...
right.
Right, we can see that, right? So we're in the terminal. Does that look clear?
Yeah.
So we're going to do... I was trying not to spell Terraform then, Ned. That was really difficult for me to do. So Terraform init. It's obviously using HCP Terraform, right? It's downloading the enterprise scale from Terraform registry, as we can see there. It's pulling everything down. So the key motto of this is configure, not customize, right? Because Microsoft may introduce changes that will break your code. So this hidden Terraform folder here, modules, don't be coming in here and messing with this.
Right. And,
right?
And don't fork the module and try to rewrite it yourself.
Yeah, because
it'll
it'll just get denied, right? As well, right? You want you want it to be upstream, like they want you to contribute, but you've got to stick to the principles. Does that make sense, right? Because it's got to work for everybody at the end of the day, right? So you can fork it, make some changes, and obviously push those changes, but they've got to be approved.
Right.
Right? So let's do a Terraform plan. So Terraform init initializes your configuration from your main file. Just want to break down the steps. Ned, correct me if I'm saying things wrong or if it's going through my own weird and wonderful way, right, of explaining things. But so that initializes everything, right? Checks your configuration. Now, there are a couple of commands that you can do. You can do like Terraform validate, right? You can do a plan. But sometimes when it says there's no errors and then it comes to apply, an error will pop up.
Right. And that
makes sense.
Due to the nature of how validate and plan actually go about doing what they do. So validate doesn't reach out to the cloud platform in any way. Validate looks at the logic of your code and uses the information it has from the providers to make sure all the arguments you're using are actual arguments that exist in the module or the provider, and that like the values you're supplying are a valid data type for that argument. So it's checking that kind of stuff. It is not checking to make sure that you're allowed to deploy that many virtual machines to a subscription or something like that. Plan talks to the actual provider and kind of interrogates what resources exist, and then it plans out what it needs to do to make what's in your config a reality. But again, it's only doing so much of interacting with the API. It's not until apply that it actually starts sending the create, update, and delete commands or posts out to the API. And that's where you can run into trouble, like going over a quota for your VM family type or something like that. Something that Terraform would have no idea about until it actually tries to apply.
That's happened to me a lot. That used to
Yeah.
be like a prerequisite before a project was go and check the quotas on your subscription to make sure you had the cores right or the server family there, right? Because
Mhm.
it's so abstracted away. That's the logic for the CSP rather than the Terraform, right? Like that's a really
Right.
good example. But as you can see here, it said 180 for core, but I've got 395 here. Like
300, that's a lot of
a
resources.
lot of resources just for management, right? What I didn't know was it's got a cost calculator built into HCP, right? That's a new one for
If
me.
if you enable cost estimation in your org, yeah, it'll do a cost estimation phase. But it's based off of the resource type, and I'm guessing all the resources that you selected don't have a just existing cost. Um,
Exactly.
and it won't calculate like a use cost because it has no idea how heavily you're going to use a resource.
It's sort of like the a basic Azure calculator cost, right? Like just
Yeah.
finger in
But
the
if you
air
had
and
the
we think we're
bandwidth
going to cost
cost set to
this, right?
0 for everything, yeah.
So these resources are free because they're just like metadata. This is the
Hmm.
management group, right? So I'm just going to hit apply. So what was weird, I had this when I was testing this out. It does I do have an error when I deploy, but it does work, right? Just to clarify things. Um that the output stream on the website, I was getting it before I hit the CLI. So if you go to Terraform Cloud, right, it'll actually show you that it's green, or something's red, right? And I think there's like a delay. But now it's obviously doing a plan again to check the state. So a declarative state that we want, right?
Hmm.
I can't remember what the default. You can't do. I'm just going to say yes to this. Parallelism on the CLI. You can dictate how many you deploy at the same time, but on HCP you can't change it. I did Google it, unless somebody wants to correct me. I think it defaults to like 20 resources by default on HCP, but again, you don't want it tripping over its own shoelaces. There's a lot of resources here, so the staggered approach is probably the best way to go. It may take a little bit longer, but it's more stable, right? Like I think I tried to crank this up on the CLI once to like 90 resources at once, and it just
Right.
bombed out, right?
Yeah. There are some built in limitations on the runners that are hosted by HashiCorp. I think if you're self hosting the runner, you
Yep.
can bump up those concurrency limits a little bit because it's now your compute. Uh, but yeah, theirs has a default of 20, and I don't think that's adjustable.
Okay. So we'll we'll be back once this deploys. You should see the screen fade in, fade back out, right? Once this deploys, and we'll head over to the Azure portal.
Okay. That sounds good.
Hello, and welcome back. And as you can see, our resources deployed successfully. We did run into some issues where we were calling the Azure API provider. There's some known issues with that. I have raised this on the GitHub repo for the Terraform Azure Landing Zone. But yeah, if we bring up my Terraform Cloud, now we haven't used Terraform Cloud before. HashiCorp Cloud. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ned. In here, we've got all our resources that I've deployed. So what's failed here is the Azure API calls, right?
Okay.
So if you run into this issue, it may have been resolved by then, right? Look out for future feedback, but everything's deployed as it should, pretty much.
Okay. So all the
392
management
resources.
groups, all the policies got applied. It was just AZ API call timed out that needs to be resolved by some other team.
Exactly. It's a complex beast, Azure, right? There's different layers.
Amen.
So
Yeah.
if we go to the management groups, we see here, like the diagram, it's deployed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We got management, identity, connectivity. They're empty at the moment. I think that's believed because we didn't deploy that at the time. So if we go to management, we can see our management subscriptions in there.
Mm-hmm.
So if I pull that up, resource groups, code to cloud management, and in there we've got our basic resources. Now, a lot of this was Azure policies, so that's what got a lot of that got deployed. So we'll go to
Say the bulk of the resources were policies.
Oh yeah,
There's like
I said
300 of them or something.
right. It was ridiculously big, right? But where is it? It's yeah. So the Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark was applied to the code to cloud root management group that we were talking about, right? It's not looking good, Jim. We probably need to look at the as my reference to Star Trek there. Sorry. Probably need to go and have a look at the compliancy on some of our resources, right? Now that we've applied those policies.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we can see things that have been deployed, if that makes sense, right? So Microsoft Cloud Security Benchmark is a great place to start, right? If you don't have a policy or regulatory compliance that you need to adhere to. But yeah, like monitoring anomalies and threat targeting sensitive data. But we've got a green from use only approved services, right? And ensure security asset lifecycle management. We could be here all day, literally. So let's go back to VS Code.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm conscious that let's clean that up. Let's do identity next. So I'm going to do Terraform in it again because we've added something, we've enabled something on our manifest, right? And the amount of times I've gone off to try and do an apply and it didn't reference it or it spat out an error. Oh, just to check belt and braces, really. Okay, I'm just going to go for a. If I do like, is it minus approve or something like that? It'll just auto apply it, Ned. What's the command when you're doing an apply when it's just like go off and do it? Do you remember it?
What's that?
You know when you're doing a Terraform apply, you can like auto approve it.
Yeah.
What is it? Is it hyphen
The
auto
flag?
approve?
It's just dash auto dash. Well, it's all one thing. So dash auto approve, but there's a dash between auto and approve.
Like that, yeah. Great.
Yep, that's the one.
Should save us some time. So maybe just quickly we'll talk about the stages here, right, as it goes through. So this is obviously contacting the Terraform cloud in the background. So it's spinning up a like a runner. That's probably a better way of like it's ephemeral compute, right? That does the Terraform plan, apply, and everything else. It's a Linux VM basically, right? Or it's a container somewhere that's running this. So it's going off. It's checking the state that we've got in Azure already. So all those policies that we were just waited in bated breath, right, to see if they'd get deployed. There was quite a lot there.
Yeah.
And now we're just going to apply the identity configuration, which is a couple of policies, I believe, against the identity subscription.
Right. The thing you were talking about where you're locking down, can't get in through RDP, can't get in through
Correct.
SSH, those kinds of things.
This is where having really good state management is going to become really effective because of all the policies that we've got here, right? And all the configuration.
Yeah, when I think about how many resources it needs to refresh, it's a lot. And
So-
it had 4 things to add. So yeah, not a whole lot being added by the identity portion.
And still at zero cost.
Woo! I like free.
Everyone likes free. But yeah, a lot of stuff to change, right? So like here it's telling us that subnets should have a network security group, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's for our domain controllers.
Right.
So it's modifying some rules.
So when the identity finishes, then we'll move on to the connectivity section?
Right? Which, believe it or
Okay.
not, is like that's when it starts getting heavy, right? That's with all our core connectivity resources. That's when you're going to have to reach out to, when we were looking through the settings.connectivity TF before. If you're doing this by yourself, you need to go and speak to your networking person to get them involved.
Right
at this stage. This is when things start to become complex, and you have to get it right. Like, if you've got a greenfield deployment, you can come back and change this, right? You can keep adjusting, but it's something that you really need to figure out and plan, right? Not rush.
Right. You want to make sure you don't have overlapping IP address ranges and that you're allocating enough address space for what you think is going to be deployed, at least in the hub VNet. And yeah, if you're planning to use site-to-site VPNs, or if you're going to
get at there, right? Yeah.
If you're going to do express route, that's a whole other conversation you need to have with the network people.
Yeah, because you have to engage a third party as well, right? To get that like certified or onboarded kind of thing, right? Because basically, you
I don't remember all the steps to getting express route put in, but I know it involves things that you can't do through Terraform. Like, you need to involve other humans and get all kinds of approvals and stuff.
So run into that Azure API error again.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just going to go and get these connectivity resources deployed.
Okay.
So I just wanted to quickly check. If I go to Home, Management Groups, go to Cloud, Platform. So Identity now has a subscription in it, whereas before it was an empty container.
Right. Okay. So it associated the subscription you fed it for identity with that management group.
Correct. So if I bring back it brings you to sort of like the source of truth, right? So the architecture, do you remember that? What we were talking about before? That's it, it's all of its glory, right? Kind of thing. And then there's implementation options here.
Mm-hmm.
Deploy with Terraform, right? There's even one for sovereignty, that kind of thing, right? So you know what you're getting when you source of truth, right? It even talks about the prerequisites. Like, we didn't go through how to install Terraform, right, today.
Right. That's true.
So getting yourself up and running with that, understanding, right, the benefits of using the module, that kind of thing, right? And again, similar to what we did on the GitHub. So this is a great place to start, right, from the Microsoft docs, and then get yourself over to the GitHub repo, right?
All right. So we just took a little break and had to do a little tinkering. And that was because the connectivity resources were being deployed to I think the management subscription.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that was because the example had us using the same instance of the Azure RM provider for all of the deployments. And we actually want to deploy the connectivity resources in the connectivity subscription. So we had to make two changes. One was to add another provider block and have that one with the alias connectivity, and then specify a different subscription ID for that one, mapping to the connectivity subscription that we wanted to use. And then the other change we had to make was in the module block. So scrolling down into the module block a little bit. Whoop, too far. There we go. The provider's meta argument allows you to provide a mapping between the provider instances in your root module and the providers that are being used by the module. The module has 3 named providers in it: Azure RM.Connectivity, and Azure RM.Management. And originally we had all of them mapping to the Azure RM default provider instance. We've updated the .connectivity one to our new Azure RM.Connectivity provider. So now when we run, once we uncomment the connectivity blocks again and run a Terraform apply, it'll create the connectivity resources in the connectivity subscription like we wanted it to.
So Ned said I didn't have to do this, but I'm doing it because I've got PTSD from it, right?
If it makes you happy.
It does. It makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside.
We want you to feel warm and fuzzy for sure.
I'm going to do a plan just because we made some changes, right? I just want to make sure.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like me and Ned have been a bit on a journey today, right? Like,
it has been. It's been a long, interesting journey that we're finally bringing in for a landing, if you will. I was curious to see if the other aliased providers are being used by the module in any way. And looking through the code, the only time I see that Azure RM.Management provider being used is for a Azure RM subscription template deployment that's named telemetry management. So if you do not add the correct, the additional alias for management, it's just going to apply that template deployment to your, it's going to apply it to the management subscription because that's what we were using for our default provider. So it didn't really matter. And the identity alias doesn't deploy any resources. I checked on that one too. So it's really the connectivity one that if you have a specific subscription you want to deploy to, you have to set up the provider aliasing correctly for that.
Interesting. So I'm hoping this works now. Otherwise, we're going to have to cut it again, Ned. Go back.
I'm going to have to drop in like 20 minutes at the
I've got to drop
max
as well. There's a yellow bus heading back to this location, right? And I'll need to run. But I'm hoping sure it'll work. We should be able to tell pretty instantly if it's going to work or not. The connectivity stuff doesn't actually take that long to deploy.
Right.
He says. Again, we're refreshing all of our state. Here we go. Right. So let's head the moment of truth. Well, the subscription's looking promising.
All right. It's good to hear.
There's some cost calculations already building up in here.
Excellent.
Proof is in the pudding, and there we go. The
Look at
amazing
that.
Ned has saved the day, right?
Woo!
Check that out. So
Proving I know a thing about a thing.
you can see here that our connectivity resources are deploying, which is amazing to see. We got our fancy DDoS also being deployed as well. And obviously, see how the DNS just keeps on adding, right? Like, look at that. Bump, bump, bump.
Boom, boom, boom.
But I love the fact that it's broken it down into sections. Again, it just makes it easier to manage, right? Because complexity, right, around connectivity. So, yeah, and it looks like it's deploying some VNets there, some policies, sorry, some other DNS zones. But yeah, that's an Azure Landing Zone deployed. So go back to our management groups. Just to recap, we deployed management subscription with the management resources in, which were the log analytics, right, and all the basic monitoring tools.
Mm-hmm.
Then we applied some policies around identity, and we placed the identity subscription into the identity management group. And then successfully, right at the end, we got the connectivity one up and running as well, right? So we got our core connectivity resources deployed. Now, just to let you know, when I vended the subscriptions, I renamed them, right? Because they come out with some GUID, right? Or some random name. So I actually rename them to match our documentation. So it's easier for me as a human being, right? We went back to that at the beginning, right? Just to make that a little bit easier. So yeah, we bring VS Code back up. This shouldn't be too long in completing. I think it's just finishing off some of the private link stuff. I just want to finish it to just make sure there's completion in there, because there's going to be some folks going, I want to see it. I'm still going to get those errors, unfortunately, right, from the Azure API piece.
Right.
But yeah, that's been a deployment using, I keep on calling it Terraform Cloud. Is it HashiCorp, HCP, right?
They renamed it to HCP Terraform because all their other HashiCorp Cloud Platform products are now called HCP something.
Something, right? Okay.
I'm not saying it was the best decision, but it's what they did.
Isn't
you can
it
call
weird
it Terraform
how, like,
Cloud if you want.
You know, when
I won't
something gets
correct you.
released, it's a bit like Twitter and X, right? Like, I still call it Twitter.
Oh, yeah. And everybody still calls it Terraform Cloud. If I wasn't teaching classes about it, I would probably still be calling it Terraform Cloud. But as an instructor, I have to use the correct terminology, right?
It's like Azure AD and Entra ID. Somebody actually came out, right? Because I remember one of the product managers jokingly came out on Twitter and said, he joined that team, right? That product team. And he went, no, I can't change it back to Azure AD, right? The name from Azure ID. But the reason is because just to set the, get the record straight. The reason why it was renamed is because when Azure AD first came out, it did this much.
Yep.
And now our identity platform does that. You can't even see it on the camera, right? But it's huge, right? The capability. It's an identity platform, right? It does lots of stuff now. So the Azure AD bit is probably like that much compared to the rest of what it does, right? So that's what I got told anyway.
I understand why the name was changed. I don't like it, but I get it. I also know that the Azure AD provider is never going to change its name because that would be
it's hard coded,
a huge breaking change for everybody using it. So it will live on forever as a Terraform provider.
That is a breaking change.
Yeah, you can't rename a provider. Well, you know why the Azure RM provider is called that, right?
No, go on.
There was an Azure provider that predated ARM. And so when ARM rolled out and they started writing a provider for it, they had to name it something other than Azure because that was supporting the classic model. So they named it Azure RM. And the other one has obviously gone the way of the dodo, but they can't rename the provider because that would break everything.
I did not know that.
Mm-hmm.
There's some
how far
Azure
back
Terraform
I go with Terraform
trivia for you there, straight from Ned, right?
I remember when they were both still in the registry, and the original one, as far as I know, is gone. Like they've deprecated everything in classic mode by now anyway. I think officially everything is not just deprecated, but forcibly removed at this point.
Right. Just checking this out quickly before we end. But yeah, looking good. Oh wow, it's bringing it online for both regions, right? So east and west there. That's awesome. Right. So I don't want to keep you on longer than you need to, Ned. So I think this is a great place for us to wrap up, right? But I'm sure this is going to complete in time, right? It's deploying some hubs, so this may take a while, right? It's pairing, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I just want to thank everybody for persevering through this video, right? Like, I don't think there's many of these videos out there, right? But I felt like it was needed because I get asked a lot, right? Like, how do I even get started with this? But yeah, if you like what we're doing, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, right? Don't forget to click the bell icon as well. And if you want to connect further with the Code to Cloud community, go to connect.codetocloud.io to join our Discord. Follow us on LinkedIn or Instagram, wherever it is your favorite social platform is. I want to thank Ned, my esteemed guest, for coming on the show. And also saving the day when it came to troubleshooting that pretty quickly, right? It was great to have an extra set of eyes on that, right? Once we get to the end. So any final comments, Ned? Any final thoughts?
Oh, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. I've always been curious about this module, and now I got to see it in action, and I feel like I have a better understanding of it. If folks want to follow what I'm up to, you can just go to nedinthecloud.com for all my links and socials, or you can follow me on YouTube at Ned in the Cloud.
Awesome. So Ned's been teaching me for years. He just didn't know it, right? So the galaxies have brought us together, but yeah, go and check out Ned's content. Like, you want to get started off with pipelines with Terraform, or like he did something on the stacks this morning, right? I saw you posted that.
I'm working on it. Video should be up soon.
Awesome. Yeah, go and check out Ned's resources on that. But thanks again, and goodbye for now.
Yeah.